This is the Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 415. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 415 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. In this episode, we are going to be finishing up our series on cybersecurity for building automation. So this is part 4 of the episode. If you have been following along, we have went through multiple aspects of cybersecurity. We talked about essentially how a cyber attack happens and different mitigating factors and strategies that you can take as you move through those different phases, from reconnaissance to the attack. And now ultimately we're looking at a system that has potentially been compromised. What do we do now? What can you do if your building automation system has been compromised, whether it's by ransomware, exploits, or some other attacks? What should you do immediately afterwards? What can you do beforehand to make the recovery of the system easier, for lack of a better word? And so we're going to take a look at all of that as we move through this episode. As always, everything will be available at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/415. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/415. So let's get started. We're going to break out this presentation into kind of 3 areas. We're going to talk about responding to an incident. We're going to talk about recovering the system from an incident. I think I said 3 areas. You got to forgive me. My ADHD can't remember if I said 3 or 4 areas, but it should be 3 areas. Like I said, we're going to respond to an incident. We're going to recover from the incident. And then we're also going to talk about something that's really important, which is the forensic aspects of the incident. Like, what do you do so that you can actually investigate what happened and determine like what was the cause of it, who was the cause of it, etc. There's a lot of things you need to do once a system is compromised. So first things first, let's talk about responding to the incident. Now, it depends on what happens. Not all hacks are going to be as clearly obvious as maybe a ransomware attack, where you go to log into your system and it's completely locked out. You're met with a screen that tells you your system's been ransomwared and you have to transfer money, usually in Bitcoin, to some organization that will give you a code to recover your system from a ransomware attack. And as always, folks, ask questions as we move through this. I will try to track these questions on the different platforms. And I'm actually, because I haven't done a podcast in a couple days, I'm going to just quick. All right, sounds good. Cool. So like I was saying, you may not have something as obvious as ransomware. You may have your first indication of a hack be that your IT group, through an intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system, starts to know that you're having abnormal amounts of data coming from your building automation system. Or maybe you are having data flowing across the network that your building automation system's on. But right, we have to go and respond to this incident. So the first thing immediately that we want to do is we want to try to isolate the system, right? We want to go and try to isolate the system from doing any more damage. Now, here's where things get a little squirrely, right? I'm not going to talk about ransomware because that's kind of obvious. Everything's dead. But let's talk about maybe someone put some malware on your BAS server and is using it as a pivot point to enter into other business systems on the customer's network or on your network. How do you isolate a building automation system that is running your HVAC? Maybe you're a hospital, maybe you're a research center, maybe you're a data center. How do you isolate a system that is running the mechanical systems that are going and making sure the environment within the building is able to actually support the day-to-day functions? And this isn't as bad as it sounds. It's not as hard as it sounds, But on newer systems, it is indeed getting more difficult, because what we have to think about here is on older systems, you may not have had interlocks and interdependent code. For example, guideline 36, and we look at air handling unit that has trim and response. And that trim and response, what that does is that totalizes up calls for cooling, calls for heating, and then trims and responds the maybe discharge air temp, maybe the discharge air pressure set point at the air handler. By breaking that logic, you could potentially disable sequences from running. So you can't just go shut everything down. So typically the strategy when something like this happens, the majority of the time, the compromised system is going to be the BAS server. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure someone can point to a situation where it has happened, but the large majority of these situations that I've looked at is a compromise of the BAS server or BAS client. It is not a compromise of the supervisory device or the field controller. So isolate the server from the actual supervisory device and field controllers. That usually is going to be your first step. And, your IT group should be able to tell you where this issue is coming from. So step one, we want to isolate the system. How do we isolate the system? We typically are going to go and separate the BAS server and or client, which are usually the two most compromised points, from the network. That will still enable us to have our supervisory devices and field controllers interfacing with one another and controlling our HVAC systems. Okay. Now, I will admit that as we get more advanced application controllers, the ones that actually have operating systems embedded in them, we are potentially going to see compromises that happen at the controller and supervisory layer, but that isn't what is primarily happening right now. So we go and we isolate that. We isolate our server and we isolate our client. Now, I want to back up a little bit because I told you I would give you some strategies on how to potentially do some mitigations that help you better respond to this. And this is where something, if you've listened to the podcast for any amount of time, excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. Get ready for the largest water bottle you've ever seen on a podcast. And for those of you listening, you didn't get to enjoy the half a gallon Yeti water bottle I was drinking from. But in all seriousness, if you've listened to the podcast for any amount of time, you know that I am a very strong advocate of virtualization. I'm a strong advocate of virtualizing your servers, virtualizing your databases. And while there are definitely operational benefits to doing that, there is a cybersecurity benefit to doing that. If you're able to determine at what point your compromise took place, which you're not always able to, and this is kind of one of the whack-a-mole situations that happens with cybersecurity. A client may have been compromised. A client, so a laptop, a desktop, whatever, may have been compromised, but the server may have the ransomware on it. So you go and you clear out the server, everything's good. You haven't fixed the client, and immediately, guess what? Server gets compromised again. So what I highly recommend is that you have images, at least on a monthly basis, of your building automation server, your building automation database, and your building automation clients. You run these, even if these are physical devices, you run a VM and or some sort of image snapshot on the OS that is running. And the reason I recommend this is that one of the things you should do is you should immediately isolate your server and clients, and then you can spin up new servers and clients on new machines. This is important. Do it on a new machine to then reintegrate and reinterface with your building automation system. As I'll talk about a little bit later, the reason we want to isolate these machines is so that we can determine from logs and various other resources. How did we go and how did we get compromised? And to what level did the compromise spread? Okay, so at this point, we've got our virtualized servers and clients. We've stood them back up. The BAS system is going to come back up. This is a very simplistic, high-level look at this, but we have isolated our existing BAS server and our BAS client because, like I said, those are the most common compromise points. We are now going to typically hand this over to our IT group or to some sort of cyber group who's going to do an analysis. They are going to look at how the compromise happened. And this is where we need to be doing something in the meantime. If we have not patched our BAS software, we have not patched our operating systems, and we do not have them updated to a secure operating system version, we need to be doing that at this point. Another big miss is we need to look at any potential external compromising. So any USB devices, any contractors that are coming on site where their laptops are potentially compromised. And so as we start to investigate, we need to find where the compromise came from. Was it an external USB? Was it an email someone opened? And we need to go and address those with mitigating controls. And when I say controls, I'm referring back to the cybersecurity controls we talked about in the past. So things like maybe an antivirus that scans any USBs, maybe a demilitarized zone computer that acts as essentially a buffer point. Whenever someone wants to log into the BAS, they have to put any USBs into this computer, and if that computer gets compromised, it can be isolated from everything else. All right, so up at this point, we've talked about responding, the immediate steps. Now we need to start to document, okay? And this is a little funky for BAS professionals and a little funky for contractors because you're not really experts in this, nor do I believe you should be experts in this, but you need to be able to assist in the documentation. So the customer's IT group should have a process, or the outside vendor should have a process for documentation, but you're going to want to be able to provide the version of the operating system, the version of the BAS software. When did you identify the compromise? What details did you get of the compromise? Basically just start documenting when all of this occurred. And then you have to assess what actually impacted the building automation system. Was this a full compromise of all the clients across an enterprise that interfaced with the BAS? Was this a compromise of the server? Was this a compromise of the database? When did this happen? And now you have to think about something that a lot of people don't discuss when they talk about cyber response to building automation system or any building system hack, which is iterative databases. So if you're in a hospital, if you're in a campus environment, the likelihood is that you are making changes all the time. You're changing your schedules, you're changing your set points, maybe you've got retrofits going on, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is even if you're backing everything up once a month to an external database, and I recommend backing up at least 2 sources, but ideally 3. So 2 sources would be a local, an external, and a remote. So a local would be on the machine, external would be on an external drive, and remote would be to like a remote data store. That's like the gold standard of backing up. Sorry, it's super dry in Arizona again. But if you can't do that, at least do 2. At least do a local and a remote, or a local and a external, ideally local and remote. But here's the deal. Let's say that Andrews, who's in our chat, Andrew sold a job, and he sold that retrofit job 6 months ago. And that retrofit job's going on right now on building A, the campus. And the campus got compromised. And now that backup that took place a month before does not include all those new points, does not include the factors that the test and balance put in, et cetera. So you have to think from a restoration perspective. You don't know if the database is compromised or not. So you're going to restore the database, you're going to restore the server, and you're potentially going to lose those tuning factors. Maybe you lose those graphics changes. So this is something you have to account for when you go and you do what's called a rollback. Is what are the changes? And this is why you really should have strong change logs in your facility. What are the changes that took place over the past month that I need to think about? Because as soon as I roll back to a month ago, maybe that chiller that's mapped in, maybe those K factors that were set are no longer going to go and exist within the system. This is something I rarely, if ever, see talked about when people talk about recovering. So let's dive into recovering. We talked about responding, gave you some mitigating ways to handle the system before it even gets to a compromised point. But let's talk about recovery, and let's talk about some best practices for recovering the system. We're going to talk about testing before we bring it back online. And then we're going to talk about how to prevent the future incidents, right? Because all three of those are really important. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go and restore from our backups. But we want to understand what our backups are, when they, excuse me, geez Louise, when they took place, and what potentially was not backed up. What is the delta between the current system and the past backup? And then how are we going to mitigate that? And you need to create a mitigation plan. That may be going and putting certain systems in hand. That may be going and having a meeting with your contractors and your test and balance folks and whatever to gather the information you need to be able to do kind of an all hands on deck. We're going to bring the system back. We're going to quickly add it from external database backups that maybe we had from a project, and we're going to bring it all back up. Once we bring it up, we need to have a test plan. And that test plan needs to cover two things. It needs to make sure that the existing system is functional, but we also need to make sure any changes were properly implemented and not impacting the system. How I like to do that, because on a campus environment, this can be massive. I like to identify the critical systems, so central utility plant, air handlers, any critical facility spaces like test labs, places with like Phoenix Venturi valves, things like that. And I want to make sure I jot those down so I'm 100% sure that those get addressed. Once we've tested that, we've brought it back online, we need to also, while we're doing that, and honestly, before we're doing that, we need to have identified the compromise, and we need to put something in place to ensure that that compromise doesn't happen again. Because there's nothing like going and reinstalling all your backups, reinstalling all your updates, getting everything good, getting everything cleaned up, and then someone brings in a USB drive and it just compromises everything all over again. So we really want to document, understand what caused the compromise, and then go and implement some security controls. So let's summarize all of this together. It's kind of a shorter episode, but it's a pretty straightforward topic in my opinion, which is it's possible. It's possible that your system will get compromised. Unfortunately, we don't have good data on building automation compromises because outside of critical environments, it's not mandated that building automation compromises are reported. And since it's not mandated that they're reported, we don't necessarily know the scope of compromises. Occasionally, some ransomware things leak out. You can go on different websites and find systems that are of versions that have known exploits. So we do know that there's the potential for exploits to exist, and we know that exploits have happened in the past. We just don't know the scale because a lot of people don't disclose it. That being said, there is a potential that it could happen to one of your customers or to yourself if you're an owner. So it's important that you followed the steps I've mentioned in the first 3 parts of this series, but it's also important that you have a backup and recovery strategy. You have a process to isolate and document the systems that were compromised. You have a methodology to then go and restore the system and test that system. And while you're doing that, you also have a process to identify what the compromising vector was, whether it was, physical, whether it was electronic, whatever. And you have a plan in place to put in mitigating controls, cybersecurity controls that will avoid that compromise happening again in the future. So there you have it, folks, a kind of high level look at what to do if your system's compromised. Granted, the majority of this process will be dictated by your IT cybersecurity governance. So that group will have policies and procedures established for recovery, for identification, recovery, and restoration in a cyber event. Definitely follow those. But if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them in the remaining time we have. I apologize for originally scheduling this for 12 a.m. in the morning. I don't know how I did that. I must not have clicked PM, but I know Mondays is not scheduled for the wrong time, so we're good there. But let's see what questions you have. I'm going to go check the regular spots. It's good to see you all again. I was traveling to Memphis, and I've just been insanely busy lately, and that has eaten up a lot of my time. So I wasn't able to get podcasts out all last week and part of this week as well. But definitely should be able to get them out on a regular basis moving forward, at least until May when I'm going to be traveling a lot again. Let's see if anyone else has any questions. I'm not necessarily seeing anything. I'll give you all a second. It's good to see the regular crew in here. Thank you so much for attending. If you haven't checked it out, our spring break sale for our courses is still going on until the end of day today. Just use Spring 23 on our e-commerce site. You'll get 25% off any course. So if you've been eyeballing a course that we have and you're like, man, I really want to take advantage of that, get some knowledge going before summertime, I encourage you to do that. All right, not seeing any questions here. So coming up, let's take a look. We've got, I want to take a look at scheduled. This shouldn't exit me. Yeah. We've got Estimating BAS Projects Part 3 coming down the pipe. And that is going to be really cool. That's going to be on Monday. And that's going to be cool because if I can open it up, we're going to be going through how to create a bill of materials, how to identify item requirements for your BOM from part 2 of the specification. And like always, we're going to have a live question and answer session. So if you're wondering how to do a bill of materials for a scoping and estimating part of a kind of deal pursuit, then I encourage you to tune into that. We're going to be going through a spec. We're going to look at section 2 of the spec materials. We're going to build up an Excel bill of materials from that. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Well, I think it's fun. You might not think it's fun. I enjoy it. So I would hope so. Run the business. All right, folks, it was great to see you in here. podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/415 will be available probably about an hour from now. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell on YouTube. Or rather, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and like and share this on LinkedIn. Like, just hit the share button and share it and be like, hey, you should watch this, and maybe tag someone. Andrew asks, what do I think about air gapping systems to prevent incidents? Great question. So let's talk about what air gapping means. So air gapping is basically the concept of isolating an OT network, an operation technology network, from the business network, often known as the IT network, or from other OT networks. So a couple ways you can do air gapping. There's pure air gapping, which is, in like government facilities where you use electric signal dampening. I remember I did a facility where we couldn't run the MSTP wires through the ceiling in certain areas because they were afraid that the audio from people talking would resonate on the wires and people could tap into the audio on the wires and be able to capture information just from the audio of people talking as these wires travel through the plenum above this secure area. So that was interesting. So there's like air gapping, or then there's what we traditionally refer to, which is just like basic 1980s BAS installations where you had the server sitting by itself connected to the supervisor. Well, maybe more 1990s. You had the server sitting by itself connected to the supervisory devices, which connect to the controllers. They're utilizing separate switches. So it's a whole standalone system, It is, thanks, Phil, 4:15 in the can on the way to the Museum of BAS. So basically, air gapping, it can be useful. I will tell you, though, that it is not an end-all be-all because a lot of compromises don't actually happen to the BAS server directly. They happen through like a contractor's laptop, a compromised USB drive, a disgruntled employee who still has the username and password and can log in. So separating these systems does not necessarily mean they can't be compromised. They still can. It just typically keeps the compromise from spreading to the greater IT network. Now, the downside of that, and not enough people talk about this. You hear a lot of people who talk about OT networks and isolating them from the IT network for security purposes. But what they don't mention is oftentimes when you have an OT network and you separate the BAS and all the associated systems from the IT network, you actually eliminate the capability of IDS intrusion detection and IPS intrusion prevention systems to actually operate on that network and detect intrusions. So your security monitoring software and appliances tend to not exist on some OT networks, not all, but some OT networks. So you actually, while isolating the spread, you do indeed isolate the spread from the greater IT network. You are now potentially hampering your detection capabilities of detecting compromises that potentially exist on that OT network. So I hope that helps, Andrew. I hope that makes sense. It was a good question. I appreciate you asking that. Let me see what else we got going on here. Cool. But yeah, folks, this is live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Arizona time. So that's Pacific time right now. It's Mountain time in the late fall, winter. But you can always hop in here, ask whatever questions you got. We do definitely appreciate that. That being said, think that's it. I don't see anything else on any of the platforms. I appreciate all of you like always. Thanks so much. And I look forward to talking to you on Monday, where we're going to build a bill of materials. We're going to do some estimating. We're going to look at part 2 of the specification. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day. Take care.